I'm delighted to report that I have joined as a scholar the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi. The center offers educational opportunities, speakers, internship, and reading groups for the University of Mississippi community. It is named in honor of the United States founding document, which constitutes the nation as a political community and expresses fundamental principles of American freedom, including in the recognition of the importance of Judeo-Christian values in shaping American exceptionalism. Dedicated to the academic and open-minded exploration of these principles, the center exists to encourage exploration into the many facets of freedom. It will sponsor a speaker series and an interdisciplinary faculty research team. If you'd like to learn more about the center, please visit OleMiss, that's OLEMISS.edu/independence/. Hi, everybody. This is Saad. I've been doing this for many, many years. I've had many unbelievable guests on my show. Few have turned me into a little schoolgirl with giddiness as much as the next gentleman I'll be speaking to right now, Professor Robin Dunbar. How are you doing, sir?
I'm very good. I'm slightly worried about turning you into whatever it was you were going to be. But
a giddy schoolgirl.
Yeah.
Well, let me tell you why. I'm going to come to a few. I prepared a few books, and this is not meant to be promotion of my work. I get enough exposure in life, but it's really an homage to you. My first book ever, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption. Robin Dunbar is in there when we're talking about the Machiavellianism, social intelligence hypothesis, the evolutionary roots of gossip, all topics that you cover, all covered in this book, number one. Number two, now this might surprise you. I only found this out earlier today. One of the photo templates of my 2011 book is what I state is arguably the rock star in the animal kingdom. My favorite animal, the gelada baboon. I found out that was your doctoral dissertation. Third point, and then I will cede the floor to you. Biography on Conrad Lawrence, and I find out that Robin Dunbar studied under Nico Tinbergen, who was one of the co-Nobel winners. Unbelievable stuff. I was going to read your stuff. I'll add it later, sort of your bio. Let's begin. Nico Tinbergen, tell us about this.
Well, that was a curious coincidence. So you have to understand that I went to university to study philosophy. Serious, what's called Oxford philosophy, or English philosophy as it was, that dominated the Western world until, well, only a decade or two ago, really. So this was, sort of what I'd been genuinely interested in and excited by. But the problem is I went to Oxford University, and you can't do philosophy on its own. You have to do it something else. And I chose philosophy and psychology as the least bad option. I had very little idea what psychology was, because you couldn't study it at high school. So, I probably read a few pop psychology books of the day. But aside from that, I knew very little about it. Anyway, I set off on this, and who should we get the first 2 terms of lectures from but young Nico Tinbergen and an even younger Richard Dawkins.
Wow!
And this was quite enlightening to me. I mean, I had grown up in East Africa. I hadn't grown up really in the UK or Europe, even if it comes to that. I'd grown up in East Africa, wandering around the bush, looking at animals, probably down the wrong end of a gun, but never mind. And this stuff that the ethologists were doing in the 60s was just amazing to me. It was fascinating. So I then went and did 2 undergraduate expeditions studying monkeys, first in West Africa the first year, and the second year in Ethiopia.
So I can see how the gelada baboon is coming up, but go ahead, keep going.
Yeah, so Ethiopia turned out to have been, well, it was a proposal that we'd gone and talked to John Crook, who had been studying the gelada baboon in Ethiopia and had done a wildlife program on the BBC television. And one of my fellow travelers had seen it and rushed off to see him to see if he had any projects we could do. And he suggested we do baboons, which is what we went and did. But then this stuff was so exciting to do field work on primates. I decided that's what I was going to do for my PhD. So I went back to him with a view to doing something on gelada, which is what I then went and did. And I did a postdoc on gelada afterwards. So 2 very long field trips. Also spent a lot of time studying antelope, and because there were simply lots of them around. I mean, what do you do when you're sitting in the middle of 60,000 projects? Why settle for one? Well, let's do lots of them. So I got very excited by ungulates. Spent much of the next decade studying ungulates in East Africa and in the west coast of Scotland. So.
And when did you make the switch to the hairless primate?
These weird things that we have to live among, Gad. Yeah. Well, it was the last thing I was interested in studying. And then come the 1980s, late 1980s, this was sort of Thatcherite, Reaganite economics at stake. Big problem, not much money in the system anywhere, no funding for trivial stuff like field studies of animals in the wild. Okay, if you're going to cure cancer, we'll give you what's left in the pot, scrape it out. But really there was no funding at all, and there were very, very few jobs. The people who worked in animal behavior, animal ecology. And so I decided, when I finally got a job lecturing at UCL in London, University College London, that I'd better think of something constructive to do, because I obviously wasn't going to be able to get back to be studying animals in the wild, because there was no money. So I thought, well, we can do what we do on monkeys and antelope, we can do it on humans too, right there in the park or in the cafeteria, in the university cafeteria, or whatever. There's lots of interesting questions we can ask. We can ask exactly the same kinds of questions as we would ask animals. So that's how that kind of transition to humans got started. And I guess the hinge point, that was from about 1988 onwards. The hinge point really came in 91, 92, when the Machiavellian intelligence idea was sort of circulating seriously. And in the course of studying a very trivial problem, namely, why do monkeys spend so much time grooming other people, not just themselves, it suddenly dawned on me you could actually test the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis directly and quantitatively, rather than kind of with just a few examples, which is how these things tended to be done. So I did that, and then kind of went, well, actually, we could stick humans into this regression equation that we get for monkeys and apes and see what it predicts for humans. And it predicted a number about 150. So I then spent some very late nights and several bottles of whiskey trying to track down quantitative data on hunter-gatherer group sizes. That's why the whiskey was necessary. It was extremely frustrating trying to find quantitative data in the ethnographic literature. But I got a decent sample, and it turned out that, I was kind of doing a reverse engineering thing here. We got a prediction of 150 for, if you like, the natural cognitive size of human groups. But what's the natural size of human groups? Humans live in complex social systems with many tiers. Which tier is the right one to look at? So I kind of went, well, let's look at all the tiers, see if there are any consistencies in numbers, and then ask which one matches 150. And that turned out to be the kind of not the one that everybody, all anthropologists seem to spend their time engaged with, which is the band, which is, turns out, in my view anyway, simply to be an ecological unit. It's an ecologically convenient unit. It's not really their living. Well, it's their living group. It's not really their social group. Their social group is the next layer up, which is a clan or a community or something like that, or a regional grouping. And that consistently, in every data set's looked at since then, has a value of about 150.
So let me mention a quick two quick stories about your Dunbar's number of 150. So in 2008, I had been invited to Indiana University. Do you know who Peter Todd is?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, Peter Todd, fast and frugal
Yep.
heuristics with Gigerenzer and
Yep.
so on. Yeah.
Yep.
So he had moved from the Max Planck Institute to Indiana University, and my first book had come out. So he invited me out. And at one point, I was meeting, unfortunately, I don't remember his name, a social psychologist, and I was meeting the people in his lab. And this is 2008, almost 20 years ago, and they had just ran some network analyses on groups, friendship group sizes online. And of course, I was armed with your Dunbar number. I said to them, so he was there, the head of the lab, the professor with a few of his students. I said, "Oh, before you give me any information, can I guess what the average size of the network was?" And so he looked at me sort of with some incredulity, like, "How would you know? You haven't looked at the data." I said, "How about if I say it's about 150?" And so he goes, "That's exactly right." And then, of course, I then explained Dunbar's number. So that's story one. Story two, at one point I was writing something and I wanted to see how many different areas the 150 comes up. And so I thought, oh, how about the average number of wedding guests at a wedding? And I had done a quick search and it came out to 148. So your immortality is safe forevermore, Robin. Are you pleased that number? Rarely do academics have an insight that becomes, part of popular culture. I dare say that Dunbar's number has. Is this something that gives you a unique sense of accomplishment in that you've crossed over?
In some sense, yes, because it's ended up being picked up and applied not just by boring old academics studying humans or whatever it may be, but that it's been taken up by computer sciences dealing with the design of social media and so on. It's been picked up and applied extensively in the world of business organization.
Yeah.
And these are sort of way outside areas that I would be interested in. And again, the other areas sort of acquired some notoriety in is network science, which is mostly statistical physics. So
Yeah.
as a result of that, I've ended up being a professor of statistical physics in a computing science department for 3 years.
But you probably never took a physics course in university.
Absolutely none. As I say, I went to university of philosophy. I was a dyed-in-the-wool humanities person through high school and really the first half of my undergraduate career. I always claim I was the origin of C.P. Snow's Two Cultures. There are
Yes.
scientists who do serious stuff, and there are humanities people who waffle. And I am on the waffling side. This science stuff is boring and tedious and what have you. But I made this enormous transition, so it's kind of fun to have ended up back in some sense.
Can I make an attempt at consilience, E.O. Wilson's gorgeous term,
Yes, yes.
linking Snow's two cultures? So this was 2 weeks ago today, actually. My birthday was on October 13th. So I received, as a matter of fact, stay on the line. I usually don't get up, but hold on a second. Do you know what this book is? Have you ever seen it?
Rhapsody, no.
This
No.
is a book by Arthur Schnitzler, who was a Austrian psychiatrist by training, who wrote this novella called Rhapsody, a Dream Novel. The rights to that novel, I'm going to link it to Snow and Consilience in a second. Bear
Right.
with me. The rights to this novella, by the way, this is a first edition 1927 that my family bought for me 2 weeks ago for my birthday. Now,
This is one of the guys out of the Vienna Circle group.
so he was not the Vienna Circle in the sense of the philosophers
No,
and the
but the
mathematicians,
wider,
but the
yeah,
wider sort of Vienna,
yes, this
yes,
extraordinary effluence of
unbelievable.
intellectual activity. Yes, I only
Exactly
just
right.
discovered it last year.
Oh,
Just amazing.
it's out of this world. It's unbelievable. So
Yeah,
anyway, so Stanley Kubrick, the famed filmmaker,
yeah.
reads this novella, and again, I want to show off. I am holding the 1927 first edition. Uh, he reads the novella, buys the rights to it, sits on it for I don't know how long, and then just before he passes away, Eyes Wide Shut is released, which is a classic movie which you should see, and it's literally the play-by-play of this book. Now, why am I mentioning this? Because it's a novella, so it's literature, but if you read it as an evolutionary psychologist, you're like, oh boy, do I get this. It's basically, just to give you the premise, it's basically about what happens when a husband and wife decide to do the ill-advised thing of sharing to with one another their secret fantasies. Now, when the woman shares some of her fantasies with the husband, it doesn't go too well for very basic evolutionary
Mhm.
reasons that we would understand. So here's an example where we are drawing the consilience, we're doing the
Right.
snow, we are building the bridge because literary Darwinism is exactly
Yes.
applying evolutionary theory to literature. That's why
Yeah.
I was so moved by this book. What do you got to say about this?
Yeah. No, no. Well, I mean, bearing in mind that I have still at least half a foot in the humanities, and sort of my kind of majors in that area, if you like, were English literature and history. And history, I actually, in those days you had to take a special exam, entrance exam to get to Oxford or Cambridge universities. They didn't care about the kind of state qualifications. They used entirely their own entrance exams. So history is my main subject, and that's what I got on. Technically, I could have studied history if I wanted to, but I've maintained an interest in both these fields. So I have collaborations with historians, sort of trying to help historians add some real backbone theory from evolution to what they do, which has in general worked extremely well and been great fun. But also, I've had on the back burner, and that's partly because there's so much of what we've done over the last 2 decades in the aftermath of the social brain hypothesis and Dunbar's number has been trying to understand how individuals create friendships, if you like, and how those are scaled up to create communities. What is it? What are the mechanisms involved? And one of those very clearly became storytelling. And this sent me back to storytelling, drama, novels, and stuff, which I'd always been interested in anyway. But we had a long 3-year project on trying to apply evolutionary ideas to storytelling in the form of drama, which was kind of fun. But I always mention. In fact, I was giving a lecture last week, big lecture down at Bristol University, and I pointed out to them. Well, I said, let me introduce you to the founding mother of social psychology, because there has never been anybody who's done it better. And um, uh, she's the classic 18th century novelist, whose name I blanked on completely now. What do I mean? Pride and Prejudice.
Jane Austen.
Jane Austen. Okay, so I said, let me introduce you to the founding mother of social psychology, Jane Austen. Nobody has such an acute sense of observation of the foibles of human behavior and got it absolutely bang on as she did. I mean, it was absolutely incredible. It's just like reading evolutionary psychology textbook.
Exactly right. Uh,
So,
oh,
so
yeah,
I
go ahead.
think, I mean, it's absolutely, and in part, I mean, I have to say, in the consilience sense, that because I have an academic foot very much in psychology and therefore mechanisms, but also a second foot in biology because I did my PhD. Although in a psychology department, I did it in a group of zoologists doing evolutionary ecology, essentially. And that was what my PhD and all my research thereafter was on animals, very much in that vein. So I have, I always look at things both in terms of their evolutionary function and in terms of the mechanisms that produce those effects. And that means that you end up sort of gradually being forced to cover every discipline that bears on what you do, from genetics and physiology right through to um, uh, uh, ecology and environments and even plants. I've spent more time peering at plants probably than most people would want to do.
Well,
And it's that because I have this very broad range of interests, and sort of spend most of my time trying to figure out how they all come together and produce this extraordinary complexity of the world we live in. It does leave me interested in and appreciative of all these other disciplines, whether they're humanities or sciences. And, I kind of don't distinguish between them. Sometimes the humanities get mislaid a little bit in terms of strange theories, shall we say.
right.
But still, history is a science. It's trying to explain something in the past. Archaeology is a science. And literature is kind of doing the same in the sense that it's meant to tell us a little bit about, how at least one person thinks the human world actually works.
Well, it's the practical application of
Yes,
deep evolutionary insights, right? So
indeed.
you create a novel, and then it is tested in the market. If it is congruent with
Yes.
basic biological imperatives, I want to read it. If it isn't,
Yeah.
I don't want to read. I mean,
Yeah.
as you probably know, I'm housed in a business school. I try to apply evolutionary psychology in various business disciplines, most typically in a consumatory setting. Well, that's a wonderful arena to
Yes.
test many of our most fundamental principles. But I want to come back in a second for a second to consilience, to interdisciplinarity. One of the things that frustrates me the most, and I dare say it's probably the same for you, is when I hear, so there are many detractors of evolutionary thinking, at least evolutionary thinking as applied to human behavior, right?
Yes.
There's the term human reticence effect. This is not my term, that basically says it is perfectly reasonable to apply the evolutionary lens to every single species on Earth except one called Homo sapiens. Once you make that jump, then you are a quack, post hoc, speculative,
Yeah.
unfalsifiable,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And what frustrates me the most, Robin, is that it is the exact opposite to that attack that you typically see in evolutionary theory, right? So the idea of nomological networks of cumulative evidence, which I discuss in my work, David Schmidt has written a great paper on it with Pilcher. The idea is when you demonstrate that a phenomenon holds true across species, across time periods, across cultures, across methodologies, across disciplines, is that suggesting that we are just sipping a martini with a cigar and coming up with fanciful stories? Or is it suggesting that we actually put our evidentiary threshold much higher than other sciences? So, do you think that we'll ever be able to break through that phoenix that keeps rising from the ashes, or forevermore will be accused of being unfalsifiable bullshitters?
Well, I think it's weird because notwithstanding, if you like, the success of the evolutionary perspective, really beginning with Ed Wilson's sociobiology tome in the mid 70s, which really turned the whole thing around. there is still an extraordinary resistance to the idea of doing or applying or introducing anything biological, genetic, or evolutionary into many disciplines. Not just this is what astonishes me. I can understand the humanities people going, "Oh, it's irrelevant to us," or it's assuming that humans are genetically their behavior is genetically determined, and we know that's not true. You can understand them saying that, but what really both disappoints and astounds me is the frequency which perfectly good biologists of good standing maintain the same attitude towards humans.
Also known, forgive me for interrupting you, also known as the Lewontin-Gould effect.
Yes, well, it is, but it's going on long since they've ceased to be affecting anything. That's what they're doing. So we did a number of attempts to demolish some of the more insane attempts to disprove both the social brain hypothesis and Dunbar's number, which still go on. I deal with probably one a week of these attempts. But anyway, we had a major onslaught onto it a couple of years back. And a paper had come out of Cambridge by a bunch of behavioral ecologists. They're mostly graduate students and maybe postdocs, arguing that the social brain hypothesis doesn't apply at all. Everything is driven by ecology, to which I sort of raise my eyes to heaven and go, well, of course it's all bloody ecology. What do you think? But the question I'm asking is, how do they solve their ecological problems, not what's driving everything back? But they had the bizarre audacity in some way to conclude at the end of their paper that in future all comparative analyses of primates, animals, mammals, whatever, for these kind of things should de facto disinclude humans. Humans should not be included. And so when we produced our enormous riposte, which I'd like to refer to as the 4 Weddings and a Funeral paper, which in knowing that would never get past editors, I carefully restructured as 4 errors and a fallacy in comparative analyses. We ended up in the last paragraph essentially saying, this is bizarre, that these are people who, there was about 10 or 12 people, authors on it. And this was a sort of big kind of mission statement, as they were. They all died in the wool, signed up, card-carrying evolutionary ecologists. How remotely possible is it for people who are in a day job, good Darwinists, to possibly say humans should be excluded? Darwin wrote 2 bloody books on humans.
Right.
What have these kids read?
Well, by the way,
I just find it shocking.
But by the way, this is how. So this book, the Parasitic Mind, really, I started writing it in my head straight out of my PhD when I got my first professorship, when I was trying to Darwinize, well, the social sciences in general, the business school in particular. And I would get these otherwise, very accomplished economists and organizational psychologists and consumer psychologists exhibiting such animus to what seemed to me the most banal statement. We can't fully understand consumers and managers and employees and investors without invoking the biological forces that cause them to behave in those arenas the way that they do. But I was a quack guy. I didn't belong in the business school and so on. And so that was originally where I got this idea of, okay, these people are parasitized, because how else could you explain such a cognitive and emotional obstacle? Their brains have been hijacked. So while the book came out in 2020, I've been damn writing this book for 30 years in my career, and I'm sure you face the same kind of animus.
Yeah. Well, we're just going back to the point you made a little earlier about business school and being in a business school or business environment. I mean, I have actually along the way done quite a few or be involved in quite a few advertising campaigns, which have been kind of fun to do, with big products. I mean, seriously big products, as well as smaller ones. But I've done them. He says, trying to justify his existence after the fact, because actually they allowed us to collect data, and so you got somebody with pockets that are so deep they don't, doing a massive great survey study that would cost an arm and a leg from one of the big survey companies is nothing, peanuts to them. I could never afford off any of my research grants to do that. So it was a kind of way of combining the sort of my interests, if you like, and getting something out of it with their advertising interests, and they were all fairly reasonable. But I've always maintained, and one of the reasons I went into that and then into some degree of business consultancy was that people who work in the real world, like businessmen or people that manufacture stuff or whatever, they're not sitting in an ivory tower with their big cigar.
Exactly right.
If it doesn't work in reality, there is money involved, and they are very averse to losing money on, stupid ideas. And yet they have bought this stuff, big time. I mean, they just get very excited. And all of them, you talk to them about this, Dunbar's numbers, which is what it should strictly be, the fractal series of numbers, of the layers. The way we create social groups out of these bonding mechanisms, and they kind of go, that explains everything I've not understood.
I want to build on what you just said. So in my own career, of course, just like you, I've had, practitioners approach me. And
Yes.
of course, I also navigate, as you said, in the ivory tower. And my observation, perfectly congruent with yours, is that I've almost never had any pushback from the practitioners. They just listen and go, oh, so you can create advertising messages that invoke our deep evolutionary mechanisms. I'm in. Whereas it is usually the academics who are wedded to what seems to be an opposing ideology that scream and shout the loudest. Because if I'm right, then they somehow think that they are wrong. So you're exactly right.
Yeah. I mean, it's just surreal, actually, isn't it? Well, it's just the age-old story that nobody except academics would spend so much time and effort and money arguing about something so trivial as they do, and you end up with these bizarre battles between people, it's in a kind of all or none game. Either we're completely right or you're completely wrong.
Right.
Right. And there are no alternatives. It's like a religion. It really is like a religion. I kind of sit back and I go, but I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying you've only given half the story.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the proximate ultimate story.
Yes, that's exactly that.
Now,
And the frequency with which people make these egregious philosophical errors, logical errors of, testing between two different Tinbergen Ys. I mean, the old man must be absolutely turning in his grave at some of the stuff that's published under his banner of evolutionary studies of behavior. I mean, it's just shocking.
do you feel that? So, and I'm not the first to say this, but I can't remember who said this, but that the cognitive and emotional, blowback against evolutionary thinking as applied to human behavior, in a sense, it is an indelible part of the architecture of the human mind. And this is why, even though you may think that you've quelled the typical detractors, then the phoenix re-arises with the next generation of imbeciles, right? And so my question is, could there ever be a mind vaccine such that now all people who study phenomena involving biological agents will one day say, yeah, I mean, of course, biological principles apply? Or the more pessimistic response would be, No, I think we will be forevermore fighting the exact same set of issues. What's your position on that?
I would say that in some sense, it's going to be very difficult to eradicate, but not impossible. Perhaps that's the place the positive end is a place to start first, because I would say it's simply a matter of proper training. And I simply hold myself up as the perfect example of this. As a dyed-in-the-wool humanities person who viewed science, any kind of science, as boring and confused even about the world. That would have been my view, but I was very lucky in that actually that helped enormously doing philosophy, because that's so rigorous in its analyses of how we think basically about the world. That it always made me very finely attuned to that. So allowed me to pick up on the issue of Tim Bergen's whys. But these were things that we were then taught right as basics, certainly as graduate students. The whole principles of Tim Bergen's four whys, which seem to have disappeared. And anyway, those with no sense of poetry have now taken to calling them Tinbergen's four questions, which I just sad. Has no music to it at all.
Right.
But there we go. You can learn. You can, in some sense, if you like, then be converted from one view to the other. But it requires better quality teaching at all levels. And I'm afraid that's where the kind of spanner in the machine slows things up. It doesn't make it impossible. It's just it's clearly going to take a very long time to overcome the attitudes of the existing teachers, whether these are high school teachers or university teachers or other influencers, as it were, in the wider sense of the term. That if you don't understand these things, and they are somewhat arcane. And my very first popular science book was really on this theme. It was called The Trouble with Science,
Right.
which essentially argued that actually science is a natural human ability. It's just that it's not a normal human ability.
Right.
In that we are capable of doing it. We have the computing power to do it in our brains, but there are too many in everyday life. It's very demanding in terms of training and so on, and thinking that you have to do, but also, evolution being what it is, has necessarily filled the brain with lots of quick and dirty heuristics, which cut through a lot of the complex thinking for us, most of which work adequately but are completely wrong.
Right.
and it's those natural heuristics that sit in the brain, I think, that are the problem, because we find it difficult to separate out motivations from functional explanations. There's sort of explanations about why I fall in love with somebody in terms of my emotional state, as opposed, which is the bit of the world we live in practice in everyday life, with the kind of stepping back into the background and seeing the bigger picture and being able to explain it in evolutionary terms or in neurophysiological terms or whatever it may be. That's the tricky part, I think, because most people are too immersed. And of course, by the time they get to be adults, they've spent, 20 plus years immersed in this much more immediate, proximate
Exactly.
level of explanation.
Well,
So,
Dawkins, your colleague at, forgive me for interrupting you, at Oxford talked about middle world, right? So that, things phenomena that happen at the nano level, your brain and mine have not evolved to understand it. Phenomena
yeah,
that happen at the cosmological level, your brain and mine haven't
yeah,
evolved. And so to use distal explanations that may have happened millions of years ago, the architecture of our human minds is not, well
yeah,
adapted
yeah,
to do that.
yeah,
And so that that was the genesis of my question, which is maybe there is this bug feature in our brain that will always make it fully capable of being parasitized by animus towards evolutionary
Yes.
psychology.
Yes. No, I think that's absolutely right, because um, these positions are, if you like, which is what I was sort of trying to say, um, are the default position.
Yeah.
And this is why it's difficult to overcome, because with each generation, it's not something which, like genetics, you can introduce a new gene, it takes off, and it's there in the population forever. That's not ever going to happen because, well, unless there's major evolution in the human mind, and I suspect we've reached the end.
Right.
There isn't much we can do from here on in, other than tinker. That you will always have this natural default for children, as it were. That's where we all start, and you either teach them in a way that reinforces those ideas, which is what tends to happen because that teachers and lecturers and what have you are all living in the real world, and we all tend to think in these simple terms. Or you can have better educated educators who can present a more sophisticated, nuanced view of evolutionary theory as we have it now, and as presumably we are going to have even better in the future, which will allow each generation to go through the aha moment that you and I, of course, went through.
I'm so glad you said this, because my next question was going to be, what was your evolutionary aha moment? And before you answer it, I can suspect that having been taught by Nico Timbergen might be where you got your aha moment, but let me give you mine. So it was first semester as a doctoral student at Cornell. I'd never heard of evolutionary psychology. I was very much interested in psychology of decision making, studying the cognitive processes of how we make decisions. Specifically, how do we search for information? When do we know when to stop acquiring additional information? That was the topic of my
Right.
dissertation. And then first semester, my eventual doctoral supervisor, who is by training a cognitive psychologist, said, hey, you should take this advanced social psychology course by this gentleman called Dennis Regan. So this wasn't an evolutionary psychology course. It was a social psychology course. About halfway through the semester, he assigns Homicide by Daly and Wilson. I read this, my brain explodes, and I said, that's it. I'm going to use the evolutionary framework in the consumer/economic setting. So that was my epiphany moment. Do you have a similar sort of moment where you say, this is where I said, this is it for me?
I guess so, actually. I mean, it's kind of more difficult, and the reason I hesitate is that having worked all the way through within that kind of environment as it gradually developed, it's very hard to say, in that sense, I was fortunate in that I lived through the scientific revolution
Right.
in the mid 70s that produced all this. And in fact, mentioning Martin Daly, I mean, he was the last person to look at my thesis, PhD thesis, before I went in for my
Wow.
Viva examination. He and I shared a room, and
That's unbelievable.
and he was a young postdoc, and he was working on sensible stuff like voles in the Sahara. It was long before he'd caught the bug. He
Yes.
came over to do plain small mammal socioecology, really. But we were all kind of influenced by this, and it's interesting to reflect back on, because that evolutionary group under John Crook in Bristol was basically creating socioecology. John Crook had invented socioecology, that social systems are a product of the animals' attempts to solve their ecological problems. So there are a deep correlation. He worked that out on birds, and then he'd applied it to primates, and and eventually applied it to humans. And at each step, everybody in the previous disciplinary congregation had abused him for bailing out when he applied these ideas to primates. The ornithologists got all upset. When he applied it to humans, the primatologists got all upset. Right. It's very funny. But anyway, we had been used to thinking in these kind of evolutionary ways, but they weren't. I mean, they were definitely not group selectionists, but they weren't clearly not group selectionist, if
Right.
you can think about it.
Yes.
And so people tend to slip into kind of group selection. And then simultaneously, as it were, sociobiology, E.O. Wilson's sociobiology and Richard Dawkins's selfish gene appeared. And that really, for all of us, I think, in that cohort, that was our epiphany, because everybody went, well, as Richard has commented actually in one of his other books many years later, you know something must be right because everybody goes, oh yeah, I knew that. I
Exactly.
just never appreciated it.
Yeah.
Right. And we had that moment. You kind of go, ah, that's it. And I really remember going, so my two field studies of gelada baboons in Ethiopia, 71, 72 for my PhD work, and then 74, 75 for my postdoc. I remember they were all bedded very much in this sort of socio-ecological framework, as it were. And I remember going out for the 74, 75 study with one framework in mind and coming back with the other, because actually we had just looking at what the animals are doing, and that to me is the key for good quality research. Well, even in physics, it's understanding your organism from the inside, right?
Right.
Otherwise, you're just inventing avatars in your own mind. It's a great problem. And if you it's being so immersed in the system you're working on, whether it's cosmology or animals or humans, that you actually can see and feel what the organism or the system is seeing and feeling. That's when you do the best quality work. Those are the people that do the best quality work, because they really understand how the mechanisms involved are working. And that's my second field study was so different in character to my PhD field study, as you might expect it to be, sort of transition from a PhD graduate student to a postdoc. But also, we had spent so long observing these animals. The daylight suddenly clicked
Y-
in the middle of that field study, and we came back, and there was Dawkins's book on the table and E.O. Wilson's book on the table, and I read those, and I went, "Yep, that's what I'm doing."
I actually, so a couple of points. Number one, I recently, so I was speaking in London and at University of Buckingham this past June.
Right.
I wish I had reached out to you. And I ended up going to Oxford for the first time ever. And Richard Dawkins was kind enough to invite me to his house. He was
Right.
filming a thing. So we had a chance to meet and so on. Also met up with, I don't know if you know him. Do you know the physicist David Deutsch?
I know the name, but
Yeah,
I've
he's
never
he's
met
an
him.
amazing guy at Oxford. But anyways, we got to chatting and so on, and so because you were saying that you were part of the scientific revolution, and so I wanted to share with you a story. And now I'm the next generation, right? I'm about, if I may say, about 20 years younger than you, and so
What?
I'm the next generation. It's nice now that everybody thinks I'm the old guy. It's nice when I'm the young guy in the room.
Yes.
But anyways, but you're only wise. You're not old. I remember 2001. You mentioned UCL. So I was at my first human behavior and evolution meeting,
Right.
HBES. It was
Yep.
at UCL that year. Were you there by any chance?
Yes, I probably was.
Oh, okay. Well, so anyway, but I don't think I had the pleasure of meeting you in person because I would have otherwise remembered.
Right. Yeah.
So I I'm going to give my talk. The room is packed. I mean, maybe 40 rows, maybe I don't know, 500 people at least. And they certainly weren't coming because I was a famous guy because I was still a very young professor. And in the back of the room were seated, and then they eventually kind of called me over. Martin Daly, Margot Wilson, John Tooby, Lita Cosmides, and David Buss,
Yeah.
all of whom were big heroes in
Yeah.
evolutionary
Yeah.
psychology, but I'd never met them. And I remember after meeting them, and they were, very complimentary. This is great what you're doing, and so on. I remember for about, 3 hours, I was in the clouds just because I had just met
Mm.
all these heroic figures. I
Right.
wish I could have added you to that personal anecdote, but I didn't have the pleasure of meeting you then.
Yeah. It's too bad. Ships passing in the night without. Yeah.
Exactly. So now you are officially, I mean, you're professor emeritus at Oxford.
Mm.
Are you, does that mean you've gone fishing forevermore, or are you still deeply involved in all kinds of academic stuff?
No, I've gone fishing
Is that
because my research and my writing is my fishing.
okay, very good. You got me worried there. Okay, that I love that. Okay, so the only thing that's probably changed is you're probably not doing sort of formal teaching. Is that true?
No, yeah, but then I haven't done teaching formally probably for the last 15, maybe even 20 years
Oh,
of
really?
my, yeah, I was latterly anyway, lucky enough to have a whole series of research professorships and things which didn't require me to do much teaching, maybe a bit of master's course teaching. Occasionally I would dip a toe into undergraduates. And I was just really focused. That's probably, if you look at my publication output, you can see the consequences of that because over that period, the number of papers I was producing was huge by any normal person's. But it was, not a function of me as such, so much as me having the time
Yeah.
to devote, and B, also having the resources, financial resources, to employ a lot of absolutely stunningly good postdocs and research fellows on my projects. So that all came about. But no, I'm the only difference is the pay scale is lower, but I still do still do what I did before, and I'm publishing about 12 or 15 papers a year and a
That's
book every two
astounding.
years.
That is astounding. Oh,
We've just sent two book manuscripts off to publishers.
which of all of the different hats you've worn in your academic career? So, of course, standing up in front of the classroom, publishing the peer-reviewed papers, publishing books that are meant for the general public, which is a completely different skill, which very few professors unfortunately master, doing public engagement, doing your public consultancy. Is there one that if you had to only do that one, this is what you'd spend your time doing? Or do you love all equally? They're all part of what constitutes an academic career.
I would say I kind of enjoy all of them,
Yeah.
but my default always is actually doing science, and that default is back on animals. I'm trying to understand primate social evolution, and through that, more generally, mammalian social evolution, and through that, vertebrate
Right.
social evolution, but well, higher vertebrate socially, birds and mammals are so bad. But that's the part. Although I haven't, no, I have done a lot. I've never not been doing field work for any length of time on large mammals until I went to Oxford in 2007, and I decided to close down my field projects simply because I wouldn't have time to do them. But what drives me is just trying to understand this enormously complex world that very smart animals live in, and why they do it, why they've evolved that way, and how they do it. And so this has been the topic of this enormous book. It's enormously long. I've just sent off to various publishers to have a look at and see if they'll take. So it's the title essentially is the four fundamental forces of social evolution. And they're not the fundamental forces that everybody thinks. That's what gives me great pleasure because it'll blindside them completely.
This is an academic book or a trade
It
book?
is an academic book.
Okay. So it will be read by 13 people.
It will be read by 13 people, which is troubling because what it does is present a completely new vision, if you like. I've been taken to describing it as sociobiology 2.0. This is picking up where Ed Wilson left off in the last couple of chapters
Right.
and unpacking those in enormous detail and finally, I think, understanding what's going on. It's been great fun to do it. And it's been great fun to do it precisely because it's so left field
Right.
that it's going to cause, exactly as sociobiology was, it's going to cause a lot of people deep angst. And there's going to be a terrible backlash. But to revert to this age-old conversion story, you know, when they finally have argued themselves out to a standstill and have come to realize that I'm right, we'll have the perfect storm of committed converts.
Beware of the ice bucket.
Yes, well, yes, I know. I'm
Uh,
also conscious of that.
for those of you who may not follow this maybe obscure reference, E.O. Wilson, which Robin just referred to, when he came out with sociobiology, even some of the folks, of course, in his Harvard departments were very hostile to him. At one point, he was giving a lecture and some detractors threw an ice bucket on him. So get ready to receive similar treatment. By the way, have you read Defenders of the Truth?
Yes,
You
yes.
have. Okay, fantastic. I've been meaning to invite her over. Several years ago, she was kind enough to send me a copy of her biography of Bill Hamilton,
Yeah,
who's
right.
who is gigantic. I mean, arguably like
Yeah,
next Darwin after Darwin.
yeah.
Maybe Robert Trivers could also go for that title. And I've never invited her, so this I just remember. Have you ever met her? This is Segerstrale, by the way. For those of
Yes,
you. Yeah.
yes. I think I did meet her very early on when she was first propounding these ideas in the context of human evolution. She was very interested in the human evolution story and the debates that were going on
Right.
amongst human evolution folk, as it were. And I think I met her in London. And I because at that time I was in a biological anthropology department, or in an anthropology department that had a big biological
At University of
human
Liverpool.
evolution group. No,
University
this
of
was
Liverpool. Oh,
UCL in
UCL.
London.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, in London. And she must have been over for some meeting or something like that. But anyway, because it appealed to my philosophical interests, I said, well, she
And
was a
your interest in
philosopher,
history, right?
and the interest in history here.
Yeah. Beautiful.
So I have a lot of time for her, and
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Last question. Although, as I always tell my brilliant guests, I could keep you here for another 5 hours. This is a question that has become customary for me to ask just because it's a nice way to end sort of on a grand philosophical note. So, one of my professors at Cornell, his name is Tom Gilovich, he was sort of one of the pioneers of studying empirically the psychology of regret. And as you probably know, there are two components to regret: regret due to action, regret due to inaction. Regret due to action, I regret that I cheated on my wife and now my marriage is over. Regret due to inaction, I regret that I became an evolutionist because my dad was an evolutionist. I wanted to become a historian, right? And it turns out, Robin, as it may not surprise you, that the biggest looming regret in people's minds is the one of the road not taken, regret due to inaction.
yes, yes,
So if I
yes.
were to ask you, and may you have many, many more years on this beautiful earth, if I were to ask you today, looking back at your life, do you have any regrets? And do you care to share your most looming one? What would it be?
I in many ways, it's actually not having done history or having done English
Ah,
as a
so
career, right? Um, History, I seriously have dabbled in, although probably most historians would not count it as history, but it's most definitely history. And anyway, it's sort of a lot of it's been based around the Icelandic Viking family sagas, as historical documents, which I mean they're just amazing. The detail that they provide. And I've always had this hankering to be a novelist or poet or something like that, and never quite got around to it. But now the time has arrived, Gad. Now the time has arrived because I've almost wrapped up all the academic stuff. That's not been published, although I could probably keep going for many years yet.
So
And actually,
do you have the confidence to take a shot at writing that novel?
yeah, oh, definitely. Oh, well, I've already started. So,
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful.
I've got a couple of novels I'm working on and a couple of major history books. Big vision history books, really, which of course are very out of fashion in history. And that's the problem, is they're not looking at the big picture, but it's really introducing an evolutionary perspective to understanding history. So a little bit
Will
more than just economics and
will you come
stuff.
back many more times on the sad truth as each of these books makes it back into print?
With great pleasure.
Well,
With
you know
great
what?
pleasure.
People say do not meet your heroes. This is a case where it made perfect sense for me to meet one of my intellectual heroes. Robin, you are a true delight. Thank you so much for coming on the show. Stay on the line so we could say goodbye offline. True pleasure and honor to meet you, sir.
And likewise, a great pleasure to be on your show. And I'm still puzzled as to why we've never met in
I know,
person.
right? It could be because you didn't ever invite me to Oxford when you had a lot more pull. It could be that.
Well, I never did invite anybody, actually. I was too busy, but
Well, I hope to remedy the situation. I am invited to come out, possibly to a House of Lords thing, possibly to ARC, the organization that Jordan Peterson started
oh,
in
right.
June. So hopefully this will be an opportunity for us to meet. I keep my fingers crossed.
Okay, sounds good.
Wonderful. Thanks, Robin. Stay on the line.